The voice that begins this story does not belong to the man who built the system. It belongs to his daughter. June Harmon was 14 years old in the winter of 1887, and she kept a journal that no one in the family knew existed. She hid it in a cloth sack beneath her bed between a broken harmonica and a pair of wool stockings she had outgrown 2 winters before. Every night, by the light of a single candle stub, she rationed as carefully as her mother rationed flour. She wrote in a hand so small and precise that a grown man would need to hold the page close to his face to read it. Decades later, a historian at the University of Minnesota would hold one of those pages close to his face, and he would not put it down for 3 hours. But that is later. That is another world entirely. This is January 1887. This is Minnesota. This is a cabin 20 feet long and 15 feet wide, built from hand-notched pine logs sealed with mud and straw, sitting on a piece of land that the Harmon family had claimed 4 years earlier, when the territory still felt like possibility rather than punishment. The thermometer nailed to the outside of the front door read 18 degrees below zero. It was still morning. The sun had barely cleared the tree line, and already the cold had a quality to it that went beyond temperature into something closer to intention, as if the winter itself had decided this year to mean something. June wrote in her journal that morning, "Mother was already awake. She is always already awake." Nell Harmon did not sleep the way other people slept. She dozed in intervals, rising to check the fire, check the children, check the temperature on the interior wall thermometer, then returning to bed for another hour before the whole process began again. She had been doing this since November, when the cold first arrived with its full authority, and by January it had become less a routine than a condition of her existence. She did not complain about it. Complaining required energy she had already allocated elsewhere. She was 38 years old. She had come to Minnesota from Ohio with her husband Walt when she was 34, with 2 children already born, and one more on the way, with a wagon full of furniture and tools, and the particular kind of optimism that frontier land advertisements produced in people who had not yet spent a winter at 45 degrees north latitude. She was not a naive woman. She had simply not yet had the specific information that this place would require of her. By January of 1887, she had the information. Walt Harmon was 42, a large man with hands that had been shaped by a decade of physical labor into something that no longer looked entirely like hands. He was not an unintelligent man. He could build things, repair things, calculate the load-bearing capacity of a wooden beam by eye and instinct alone. What he could not do, and what Nell had understood within the first year of their marriage, was see the full picture of a situation while he was inside it. Walt solved the problem directly in front of him. Nell solved the problems that were coming. Their son Thomas was 18, tall and lean, in the way that young men on the frontier became lean, which was to say, not by design, but by necessity. He had his mother's habit of watching before speaking, of letting a silence develop long enough to understand its shape before he filled it. Their daughter June had inherited this trait even more completely. She observed everything and recorded most of it, and said very little that she had not already considered from multiple directions. The youngest was Rebecca, 7 years old, who slept on a pallet in the kitchen near the stove, because the bedroom at night dropped to temperatures that were not survivable for a child that small over the course of 8 hours. Nell had moved her there in November without explanation, arranging the pallet with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone solving a problem before it became a crisis. The cabin had one central room where the family spent most of their waking hours, a small kitchen at the back, and 2 bedrooms that in the deepest cold became essentially unusable after dark. The heat source for all of this was a cast iron stove that stood in the center of the main room, 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, with ornamental feet cast in the shape of something between a bear paw and an oak leaf, and a firebox lined with brick that glowed cherry red when the fire was running full. It weighed 412 pounds. Walt had measured it one sleepless night using a scale he had borrowed from their neighbor Dale Pruitt, because he needed to understand the mathematics of the thing that was consuming their resources. The mathematics were not encouraging. 9 cords of firewood per month. At 30 cents per cord, that was $2.70 every single month just for heat. Walt's annual income from the land from what they could sell and what work he could find came to roughly $15 in a good year. The winter of 1887 was not by any measure presenting itself as a good year. But here is what Walt did not know and what Nell had known for 3 weeks before this particular January morning. She kept 2 books. The first was the household ledger that sat on the shelf above the kitchen work table, open to anyone who wanted to look at it, documenting expenditures in the careful columns that any frontier family maintained as a matter of survival discipline. Firewood, flour, cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, condensed milk at 15 cents per can, candles. The figures were precise and honest and told a story of a family managing difficult circumstances with rigor and care. The second book was smaller. It fit inside the front pocket of her apron. She had been carrying it there since October, and in it she wrote the numbers she did not show Walt. Not because she did not trust him, but because she had learned over 12 years of marriage that a man told about a crisis he cannot immediately solve will sometimes become so focused on solving it that he stops being able to function in the present. She needed Walt functional. She needed him chopping wood and maintaining the cabin and making the 1,000 small repairs that a frontier structure required to remain livable. She would carry the full weight of what they were facing until the moment came when he needed to know. That moment was coming. She could feel it the way she could feel a change in weather through the walls of the cabin, a pressure shift, something moving toward them that had not yet arrived. On the morning of January the 9th, she sat at the kitchen table with both books open in front of her, the visible one and the private one, and she added the columns one more time. The private book was worse than the visible one. The winter had consumed resources at a rate she had projected in November as possible, but hoped was unlikely. It had proven likely. The math was now exact and unforgiving in the way that frontier math always became exact and unforgiving when there was no longer any room in it for optimism. $8. That was what remained after the current month's firewood was paid. $8 for everything else. Food through March, any medicine that became necessary, seed for spring planting, any repair that the cabin or the equipment required between now and the thaw. $8. She closed the private book and placed it back in her apron pocket. She opened the stove and fed in 2 more logs, watching the fire take them with the appetite of something that understood it was essential and therefore felt no obligation to be economical. Then she began making breakfast, and she was doing this standing at the stove with her back to the room when Walt came in from checking the livestock and brought the cold in with him like a physical object. He stood near the stove and said nothing for a moment. This was the thing about Walt that Nell had come to read as fluently as she read the household ledger. His silences had different textures. The silence after a hard day of labor was flat and exhausted. The silence when he was planning something had a particular quality of compression to it, like air before a storm. The silence he brought in from the cold that morning was the third kind, the kind she had been dreading since November. He was calculating, and he was coming up short. She did not turn from the stove. She gave him the silence he needed to arrive at what he was going to say. He said 9 chords last month. He said it the way a man says something he has been rehearsing without meaning to the words coming out already worn at the edges from being turned over in his mind. He said that at this rate, with 6 weeks of real cold still ahead of them, he didn't see how they made it through without something changing. Nell stirred the pot. She said, I know. 2 words. She had been carrying the knowledge of those 2 words for 3 weeks, and she released them into the room with the controlled precision of someone who had been waiting for the exact right moment, which was not the moment when she first had the information, but the moment when he was ready to receive it. He looked at her back. He said, how long have you known? She said, long enough to know there's no easy answer. This was the marriage. This was the interior language of 12 years of shared survival, where full sentences were sometimes a luxury, and the spaces between words carried as much information as the words themselves. He did not ask her why she hadn't told him sooner. He had learned at some point in the middle years of their marriage that Nell's timing was never careless. That same week, Dale Pruitt came by. Dale was 50 years old and had been on his land 3 years longer than the Harmons, which in the territory gave him a kind of authority that he exercised with the blunt confidence of a man who had survived things and believed survival conferred wisdom rather than luck. He was not an unkind man. He was a certain kind of man, the kind that the frontier produced in quantity, who had organized his understanding of the world into categories of what worked and what didn't, and who applied these categories with the efficiency of someone who could not afford to be wrong. He had lost 2 cattle and a goat in the previous week. He stood in the doorway of the Harmon cabin with his hat in his hand, and he told Walt that the winter was going to take more before it was finished, and that the families who had come out here without sufficient reserves were going to have to make hard decisions. He said this with the particular Midwestern directness that functions as honesty, while sometimes tipping into something closer to verdict. Nell was standing at the far end of the room near the bedroom doorway, and Dale Pruitt had not looked at her once since he came in. He was speaking to Walt. He was always speaking to Walt. This was not unusual. This was simply how the world organized itself in 1887 on the Minnesota frontier. Dale said that he'd heard of 3 families in the eastern part of the settlement talking about giving up their claims and heading back toward the cities. He said this without judgment as a statement of fact. He said that a man with children had to think about what he owed his children before he thought about what he owed his land. The room was quiet for a moment, and then Nell spoke. She did not raise her voice. She spoke from the end of the room in the same tone she used to make statements of fact, the same tone she used to say the temperature had dropped or the cornmeal was running low. She said, "We didn't come this far to quit, Mr. Pruitt." Dale turned and looked at her. It was the look of a man who has been answered by someone he did not expect to answer him, not offended exactly, but recalculating. His eyes moved from her face to Walt's face and back again, reading something in the geometry of the room that he was revising in real time. He left shortly after. He said nothing about her words directly, but when he turned at the door to say goodbye, he looked at Nell rather than Walt, just for a moment. Then he was gone. That night, after the children were in bed and Rebecca was settled on her kitchen pallet with an extra blanket Nell had tucked around her without waking her, Walt sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a stick of charcoal, and he began drawing. Nell washed the evening dishes and watched him from across the room without appearing to watch him. She had learned this long ago, the art of peripheral attention, the ability to track the thing that mattered without making the tracking itself into a pressure. Walt drew for a long time. Then he looked up. He described the idea slowly, the way a man describes something he is not sure he believes himself yet. The stove, the earth, the thermal mass of ground that stays insulated below the frost line, that holds warmth from the summer months, deep in its layers, that could theoretically be used not as the enemy of heat, but as its container and conductor. He described an underground chamber, a chimney running at an angle through the earth, a system that had never been built before as far as he knew by anyone. He said, "I know how it sounds." She looked at him across the kitchen table. She looked at the drawing, the rough lines of a system that existed only on paper and in the mind of a man who had never studied thermodynamics and was reasoning from instinct and desperation in equal measure. She thought about the $8 in her apron pocket. She thought about the 3 families heading east. She thought about Dale Pruitt's face when she had spoken in that moment of recalculation. She thought about her children, Thomas and June in their cold bedroom, Rebecca on her pallet by the kitchen stove. She said, "Then we try." Walt looked at her. He said, "You understand what we're risking." She said, "I understood before you did." He didn't ask what she meant. He went back to his drawing. What Nell did not tell him, what she did not tell anyone, was what happened after he went to bed. She sat at the kitchen table alone with the lamp turned low, and she opened the private book. She wrote in it for a long time. She wrote the current state of their resources. She wrote the projected cost of the materials they would need. She wrote what they would do if the system failed completely, the sequence of decisions that would have to be made, the order in which they would have to be made, the things that could be sold and the things that could not. She wrote the names of her 3 children. Not as a dramatic gesture, not from despair. She wrote them the way a commanding officer reviews the names of the people whose lives depend on the decisions being made in the next room. Methodically, completely. She was not preparing for surrender. She was preparing for every outcome, because the only thing more dangerous than a bad outcome was a bad outcome you were not ready for. June, she wrote, Thomas, Rebecca. She sat with those names for a moment. Then she closed the book and put it back in her apron and went to check the fire. What she did not know, yet what she would not know until much later, was that on the other side of the bedroom wall, June was awake. June was always awake when she should have been sleeping. She was lying on her side with her eyes open in the dark, and she was thinking about heat. June had been thinking about heat for several weeks. She had been conducting what she did not yet have the vocabulary to call an experiment, pressing her palm to different surfaces of the cabin at different times of day and night, the wall near the stove, the floor directly beneath the stove, the floor 3 feet away, 5 feet away, recording the results in her journal with a thermometer that had belonged to her grandmother. She had noticed that the floor close to the stove was measurably warmer than the floor near the walls. She had noticed that the warmth diminished in a pattern that was not random, but followed a logic she was beginning to understand. She had drawn diagrams. The diagrams were rough, the work of a 14-year-old with no formal training in physics, but they showed something real. They showed heat radiating outward from a central point, diminishing with distance, following a curve that June had plotted by measurement rather than theory. They showed that the warmth in the cabin was not distributed equally, but gathered near its source and faded as it moved away. She had also noted something that she could not yet fully explain. The floor directly above where the stove sat on its base conducted warmth differently than the floor beside it. The material beneath mattered. What the heat moved through determined how far it traveled. She had not shown these diagrams to anyone, not yet. She lay in the dark and listened to her mother moving around the cabin, the particular soft sounds of Nell's nighttime circuit, the stove door opening, the logs settling the floor creaking in the pattern. June knew so well she could track her mother's path through the cabin by sound alone. Then silence. Then the sound of paper, the faint turn of pages. The private book. June knew about the private book. She had seen her mother writing in it, had seen the way Nell's body curved around it when she wrote, the particular posture of someone protecting something, not from theft, but from the weight of being known. She did not know what was in it. She suspected it was the real numbers, the ones the family wasn't shown, the ones her mother carried alone. June wrote in her own journal, "Mother keeps the real story close to her chest. I think this is what it means to be the person everyone depends on. You cannot afford to show them the floor of the situation until you know where they can stand." She was 14 years old when she wrote that. The morning after Walt explained his idea and Nell said, "Then we try," June came to the kitchen before breakfast and spread her diagrams on the table in front of her father. She laid them down with the care of someone presenting something fragile, and she explained what she had measured and what the measurements showed, and she told him the things she had not yet been able to fully explain, that the material beneath the heat source changed how warmth moved. That density mattered, that what surrounded a heat source was not neutral, but active, either helping or preventing the movement of warmth into the space above. Walt looked at the diagrams for a long time. He looked at the careful notation along the edges, the temperatures at different distances from the stove, the observations about material and conductivity. He looked at his daughter's face. He said, "How long have you been doing this?" June said, 6 weeks. He picked up the diagrams and carried them to the window where the light was better and looked at them again. Then he set them carefully on the shelf above the work table in the place where important things were kept. And he said, "These are going to matter." He said it with the certainty of a man who has just been given a piece of information that changes the shape of what he is building. And he meant it, and June understood that he meant it, and she went to breakfast. Nell, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, said nothing. She turned back to the stove. The digging began that same morning. Thomas drove the first shovel into the cabin floor at 7 o'clock after Walt had carefully pried up the wooden planks and stacked them against the wall with the precision of a man who understood he would need them again. The planks came up clean. The earth beneath them did not cooperate with the same willingness. The ground was frozen, not frozen the way water freezes, which is to say, not frozen in a way that suggests it might eventually relent. Frozen the way the stone is stone, mechanically, completely with ice crystals, binding the soil into something that had no interest in being moved. Thomas's first real swing bounced the shovel back up with a vibration that traveled through the handle, through his palms, through his wrists, into the bones of his forearms. He looked at the shovel, he looked at the ground, he swung again. Walt worked beside him. They did not talk much. The cold inside the cabin, with the floor open to the earth below, dropped immediately and significantly, and talking required energy that both of them were already spending on the work itself. Their breath came in visible clouds that hung in the air and then dispersed, and the sounds of the digging filled the cabin with a rhythm that was less like construction and more like argument, the repeated impact of iron against frozen ground, the occasional scrape of loosened material being cleared away, the silences between strikes where both men readjusted their grip and considered the small progress they had made. By midday of the first day, they had gone 18 inches. Nell had moved Rebecca to sleep with June during the excavation period, the two of them sharing June's bed with an extra quilt pulled over, both close enough to share warmth. She had arranged this the night before the digging started, quietly, while the girls were already in bed, moving the small pallet and the blankets without making it into an event. Rebecca had barely stirred. June had looked at her mother in the dark and understood, without being told, that this was part of the management of something larger, one of the 100 small adjustments Nell made continuously to keep the family situation from becoming worse than it already was. Nell did not watch the digging. She worked in the kitchen, maintaining the routines that kept the family alive. The bread, the broth, the measured portions of everything that had to last longer than comfort suggested it should. She listened to the sounds of the work without appearing to listen, tracking the rhythm of it, for changes in pace, for silences that lasted too long, for the particular quality of sound that meant something had gone wrong rather than merely difficult. She had her own work that was invisible to everyone in the cabin. Before Thomas drove the first shovel into the ground, Nell had gone through both books one more time. The visible ledger and the private one. She had updated every column. She had calculated the materials Walt would need, the additional rope, the clay that would have to be dug from the depression near the eastern property line, the stones that would need to be hauled from the collapsed fence line half a mile distant. She had assigned a cost to each of these and subtracted them from $8 and arrived at a number that she wrote down and then looked at for a moment before she closed the book. She did not tell Walt the number. He needed to dig. He needed to believe that digging was worth doing. Those two things were not compatible with the number she had written down. By the third day, Thomas's hands had blisters that bled into his gloves. He did not mention this. Nell noticed when she washed the gloves in the evening and found the stains, and she set out clean cloth strips beside his breakfast. The next morning, without comment, he wrapped his hands before he ate and went back to work. The pit deepened, 3 feet, 4 feet, 4.5. The earth changed as they went down, the color shifting from the dark surface soil to a lighter brown and then to something almost mineral pale and dense. And the temperature of the earth itself changed too, not dramatically but measurably, a few degrees less cold than the surface, because the summer's warmth was still stored in those deeper layers. June measured the temperature at each level with her grandmother's thermometer, recording the numbers in her journal with the date and the time and notes about the soil color and composition notes that Walt began consulting in the evenings when he was planning the next day's work, cross-referencing her observations about soil density with his calculations about the thermal medium he would need to build around the stove. Walt lost weight with a speed that alarmed Nell without surprising her. She had calculated it. A man performing heavy labor in extreme cold burns between 4 and 5,000 calories a day, sometimes more. Walt was consuming perhaps 2,000. The deficit was being drawn from his body in the visible way that such deficits always are, from the face first, then the shoulders, then the way a man carries himself when he is running below the minimum that his body requires to maintain itself. On the fifth day, Nell adjusted the ration allocation, not dramatically, not in a way that would cause argument, because argument required energy and produced nothing useful. She simply began giving Walt portions that were slightly larger than the ledger accounted for portions that came from the allocation she had been quietly reducing for herself since the first week of January. She had a table for this in the private book columns of caloric estimates, what each person needed, what each person was receiving, where the differences could be absorbed. She had been eating less than her body required for 3 weeks already. She could continue doing so. Walt could not afford to continue the deficit he was running. Walt did not notice immediately. Thomas noticed on the second day. He watched his mother serve his father and then serve herself, and he watched the difference in the portions with the attention of a young man who had been raised by a woman who counted everything and therefore understood that a difference in portions was never accidental. He looked at his mother. She looked back at him with an expression that communicated with the economy of long familiarity that this was not a subject for discussion. He said nothing. He ate his breakfast. He went back to the pit. On the sixth morning, Walt noticed. He looked at his plate and then at Nell's plate and then at Nell. He said, "That's not equal." Nell said, "You're burning more than I am." He said, "Nell." She said, "Eat, Walt." He said, "I'm not going to sit here and watch you give me your food." She set down her fork. She reached into her apron pocket and she took out the private book and she opened it to the page with the caloric calculations, the allocation table she had been maintaining since January, and she placed it in front of him. She held the page with her thumb so that it showed only what she intended to show: the numbers about calories, the labor requirements, the deficit he was running, the adjustment she had made. She did not open it further. She did not show him the page with the $8 or the names of the children or the sequence of decisions that failure would require. That was not what this moment needed. He read it. His face did not change expression in any dramatic way, but something behind his eyes shifted, a kind of recognition that was also a reckoning. He was reading the evidence of his wife's management, the precision of her accounting, and he was understanding that what had appeared to be a simple act of generosity at the breakfast table was in fact the output of a system she had been running in parallel to everything else she was doing. He looked up. She said, "Eat, Walt. We need you to be able to lift the stove." He ate. He closed the book and returned it to her without looking at the other pages. He went back to the pit and he worked with a quality of effort that was different from the previous days, not harder exactly, but more deliberate. The work of a man who has been shown something about the situation he is in and has decided that the situation deserves his full seriousness. The pit reached 5 feet on the eighth day. The walls were rough and prone to crumbling, and Walt and Thomas began the work of reinforcing them with stones hauled from the collapsed fence line on the sleigh across snow that was now thigh-deep in the open. The mortar was clay that Nell and June had dug from the Eastern Depression and mixed with water to a consistency that Walt specified by feel, pressing it between his fingers and adjusting until it was what he needed. Nell dug clay with her bare hands for 2 hours on the afternoon of the ninth day, pressing it into the wall gaps, while Walt and Thomas fitted stones. The cold from the earth came through her palms and climbed her wrists, and she pressed harder, using the pressure to push the clay into every gap, every place where heat could escape. When she finally stood up and climbed out of the pit, her hands were raw and the skin across her knuckles had cracked in 2 places and was bleeding into the clay she had been working. June saw this. She brought cloth strips and wrapped her mother's hands without speaking, with the careful attention of someone who has learned that the best way to acknowledge a person's suffering is to address it practically rather than emotionally. Nell led her. Then she went back to the kitchen to start the evening meal. On the 11th day, the underground chimney was complete. Walt had built it from the same salvaged stone rising from the stove's flue outlet at a 45-degree angle through the earth emerging through the cabin floor near the northeastern corner and extending above the roof line. His hands by this point looked like something that had been through a different kind of winter than the one happening outside. The blisters from the first week had broken and healed and broken again, and there were places where the skin had thickened into something that was neither blister nor callus, but a state between painful to the touch, but functional. He did not stop. On the morning of the 12th day, Walt lowered the stove. This required rigging ropes and wooden pulleys anchored to the cabin's main support beam, a system that Walt and Thomas had designed together over 2 evenings of discussion that ran late into the night while Nell listened from the kitchen and occasionally offered observations that were quiet enough to sound like thinking aloud, but specific enough to redirect the conversation when it was heading somewhere structurally unsound. The descent took nearly an hour, 412 pounds of cast iron moving down through 5 feet of earth, guided by 2 men on ropes and the concentrated attention of everyone in the cabin who understood what it would mean if the ropes failed or the stove swung wrong and struck the stone walls. Nell stood in the main room and watched. Rebecca stood beside her, pressing against her side, holding her hand with both small ones and saying nothing. The stove settled onto its prepared base of sand and clay, with a sound that carried through the cabin floor and up through the soles of their feet, a bass note of weight finding its place. Walt looked up from the pit. He said, "It's in." Nell said, "Good. Come up and eat something." He came up. She served a full meal portion she had set aside across the previous 3 days to make possible, and no one commented on the fullness of the plates because no one needed to. They ate together in the warmth of what the surface stove could still provide, and for that one meal, the arithmetic of survival permitted something close to sufficiency. June wrote in her journal that night, "Today, the stove went underground. Father looked like a man who has just done something he doesn't fully believe yet. Thomas looked like a man who has been lifting heavy things for 2 weeks and would like to stop. Mother looked like she always looks, which is like someone who can see further ahead than the rest of us and has decided not to say how far. Rebecca fell asleep at the table before the meal was finished. Mother carried her to bed without waking her. The air intake system took 2 more days. A hollow wooden conduit lined with clay running from outside the cabin, beneath the frozen ground and connecting to the base of the stove's firebox. Thomas dug the second trench while Walt worked on the connection points, and by the 14th day, the system was complete, all its components in their intended positions. Walt lit the fire on the afternoon of the 14th day. He built it carefully, starting small, adding fuel in increments, monitoring the draft with a strip of cloth held near the connections to check for airflow. The fire caught. The wood took. Heat began to build in the buried firebox invisibly at first, then with an accumulating presence that changed the quality of the air around it. For 10 minutes it seemed to be working. Then the smoke came. It did not come from the chimney. It came from the floor. It came from the gaps around the stove's position, from the edges of the clay seals, from every small imperfection in the system that the pressure of smoke had found and used. It came in a rolling gray-black cloud that filled the lower half of the cabin with the speed of something that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Nell was the first one out the door. She moved without drama, without panic, taking Rebecca by the hand and walking to the door and opening it and stepping out into the cold with the efficiency of someone who has already rehearsed this possibility and knows exactly what to do. Thomas followed. June followed. Walt came last, coughing, pulling the door shut behind him. They stood in the snow outside the cabin. The cold was immediate and complete. Rebecca pressed against Nell's side. Nell put her arm around the child and stood very still. Walt said nothing. He stood with his head slightly bowed, the posture of a man who is absorbing a blow and has not yet decided what to do with the pain of it. Dale Pruitt appeared at his fence line across the field. He had seen the smoke. He stood at the fence and looked at the Harmon family standing in the snow outside their cabin, and he did not move closer and he did not call out anything. He simply stood there. Then he turned and walked back toward his own house, and his silence was its own kind of statement. The silence of a man whose prediction has been confirmed and who has the decency not to say so out loud but lacks the generosity to pretend he doesn't know. Nell saw him. She watched him walk away. She felt something in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but occupied the territory between them, a cold, flat feeling that contained both. She did not allow it to stay. She pressed it down with the practical deliberation she applied to everything that could not be afforded. Walt finally spoke. He said the chimney isn't drawing. His voice was flat. Not defeated, not yet, but stripped of the quality that distinguishes a man who believes from a man who is simply continuing, because stopping is not yet an option. Nell said, then we figure out why. He looked at her. The question he could not ask directly was, in his eyes, the question of whether her belief in the project had survived what had just happened. She met his eyes and she did not look away, and that was his answer. They went back inside when the smoke had thinned enough to breathe, and Walt began examining the system with the focused attention of a man who has decided that failure is a diagnostic rather than a verdict. The problem, as he eventually articulated it, was the chimney's vertical section. Not tall enough. The smoke was reaching the transition point without sufficient temperature and pressure to continue upward, and so it was doing what smoke does when it cannot go up. It was going everywhere else. 3 days. That was what it took to dismantle the chimney and rebuild it correctly. The vertical section was extended, rising 4 feet above the roofline. The underground angle was steepened. Walt worked with the focused economy of a man correcting his mistake without the luxury of extended reflection on how the mistake was made. Nell worked beside him. She mixed mortar when mortar was needed. She handed stones when stones were needed. She did not speak about what had happened or what it meant. She simply worked. On the second night of the rebuild, very late, Thomas came and found Nell sitting at the kitchen table alone. He sat across from her. He looked at his mother's wrapped hands and at the private book lying on the table and at her face, which in the lamp's low light showed the exhaustion that comes not from physical work, but from sustained mental load, from carrying the weight of a situation longer than comfort allows. He said, "Are we going to make it?" Nell looked at her son. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She looked at the private book. She looked at Thomas. She said, "I think your father is going to fix the chimney, and then we're going to have a different problem." He said, "What problem?" She said, "The heat won't come up through the floor. He hasn't solved that yet." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the floor, the wooden planks that had been replaced over the pit, and he was thinking. Nell could see him thinking, the focused inward expression of someone following a thread of logic through territory they had not been in before. He said, "The earth around the stove." "How tight is it packed?" She said, "Tight." Walt packed it as tight as he could. He wanted it stable. Thomas said, "That's the problem." He said it quietly with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who has just arrived somewhere they cannot believe no one else has already been. He said that heat needed to move, that it moved through materials with enough porosity to allow circulation, the way water moves through gravel, but not through clay. That packed earth, dense and sealed, was a container, not a conductor. The heat would sit in it. It would not rise. It could not rise because it had nowhere to move to. Nell listened. She did not speak until he was finished. Then she said, "Tell your father that in the morning. Thomas said you already knew this." It was not quite a question. Nell looked at her son for a moment. Then she said, "I had a feeling. But you worked it out. That's different." He looked at her. He was 18 years old, and he was smart enough to understand what she had just told him, which was that she had let him find the answer rather than giving it to him, that she understood something about the relationship between a young man and his own intelligence that required a certain kind of space to develop in. He said, "You do that a lot, don't you?" She said, "Do what?" He said, "Know things and wait." She stood up and closed the private book and put it back in her apron pocket. She checked the fire. She said, "Get some sleep, Thomas. Tomorrow you're going to explain convection to your father." She went to bed. In the morning, she came down and found Walt at the table with his drawings, and Thomas standing beside him explaining something with his hands, and Walt listening with the still attention of a man receiving information that is reorganizing what he thought he knew. Nell put water on for coffee. She listened from the kitchen. She heard the silence that meant understanding had arrived. She poured the coffee. The third attempt began on a Tuesday evening in late March. Outside, the snow was showing the first tentative signs of what it might eventually become if the cold decided to relent. Patches of brown earth visible along the southern fence line where the wind had worked the snow down to nothing. The sky in the late afternoon holding a quality of light that was different from February's light, not warmer exactly, not yet, but with a different intention behind it. Inside the cabin, Walt and Thomas had spent 4 days carefully dismantling the earth packed around the stove and rebuilding it in layers. Not dense clay, not the sealed compressed earth that had held the heat like a prisoner. Instead, a mixture clay and sand and small stones layered and compressed, but not sealed porous enough to allow the circulation of heated material that was the difference between a container and a conductor. Walt had consulted June's density observations in this work, her notes about how different soil compositions at different depths had conducted or resisted his shovel using her 6 weeks of floor temperature measurements to calibrate the gradient he was building, the careful layers that would let warmth rise rather than trap it. On the evening of the third attempt, Walt built the fire slowly. He started with kindling and worked upward, adding fuel in increments, watching the draft with a strip of cloth near the underground connections the way a doctor watches a patient's breathing. The cloth moved. The air was being pulled in. The draft was functioning. The smoke went up. All of it. The cabin stayed clear. The family breathed. Nell was at the window. She had been standing at the window since Walt struck the first match, watching the chimney above the roofline, watching for smoke. When she saw it rise correctly, when she saw it go up and away and disperse cleanly into the evening sky, she placed one hand flat against the cold glass, and she let herself feel the relief of it for exactly as long as she could afford to feel it. Then she turned back to the room. She said, "Good. Now we wait." They waited. The first 20 minutes produced nothing except a clean draft and the sound of the fire building in the underground chamber. Walt pressed his hand to the floor above the stove. Nothing. He pressed it to the floor 2 feet away. Nothing. He looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the floor. Neither of them spoke. Nell went to the kitchen and began the evening meal. Not because she was not paying attention, because the evening meal needed to happen regardless of what the floor did or did not do, and because standing in the main room watching her husband press his palm to the floorboards was not a thing she could do and remain functional. She cooked. She listened. She tracked the quality of the silence in the other room the way she tracked everything in the cabin. At the 40-minute mark, Walt said something. He said it quietly, not to anyone in particular, more to the floor itself, or to the idea he had been carrying since January. He said, "There it is." Nell set down what she was holding. She walked into the main room. Walt was on his knees on the floor with both palms pressed flat against the wood, and he was looking up at her with an expression she had not seen on his face in a very long time. He looked like the man she had married in Ohio, the one who had read a land advertisement and believed it. She knelt down beside him. She placed her right hand on the floor. It was warm, not hot, not the dramatic scorching heat that a surface stove produced when it was running full. Warm in the way that a living thing is warmed steadily from within, with a quality that was less about temperature and more about presence. Like the floor had woken up, like the earth beneath it had finally agreed to participate. She moved her hand 2 feet to the left. Warm. 3 feet. Still warm. She pressed harder, as if pressure could confirm what she was already feeling. Thomas said from across the room, "What's the temperature?" June was already at the interior thermometer on the wall. She said 52. She paused. She said 53. They watched it move. 54, 55. The increments were small and slow and absolutely real. The cabin was warming, Not from the air, not from a stove, standing in the center of the room, radiating heat in a 6-foot circle, while the edges of the space remain cold enough to see your breath. From the floor, from the earth. The warmth was coming up through the wood and into the room from below, distributed consistent present in a way that a surface stove could not achieve, because a surface stove was a point and this was a plane. Nell was still on her knees. She did not stand up immediately. She stayed there with her palms on the warm floor, and she let the heat come through her hands, and she felt it travel up through her wrists and into her forearms. And she stayed very still with it for a long moment that she did not rush. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, drawn by the change in the quality of the room. She walked to her mother and stood beside her. Nell took her daughter's small hand and placed it flat on the floor. Rebecca said, "It's warm." Nell said, "Yes." Rebecca said, "Is it supposed to be warm?" Nell said, "Yes, it's supposed to be warm." June wrote in her journal that night the floor temperature at the point directly above the stove reached 61 degrees by 8 o'clock in the evening. At 3 feet from center, it was 58. At 6 feet, it was 54. The ambient cabin temperature reached 60 degrees for the first time since October. Mother knelt on the floor for 4 minutes before she stood up. I counted. I think she needed to be sure it was real before she trusted it. Walt slept that night the way he had not slept since November, without the interrupted wakefulness that had kept him surfacing at 2-hour intervals all winter. He slept flat and complete, and in the morning the cabin was 52 degrees, and he lay in bed for a moment before rising, feeling the air, measuring it against his memory of every other morning of this winter, and finding it different in a way that was simple and specific in everything. Nell had been awake for an hour before he rose. She had checked the fire, stoked it from low to sufficient, measured the wood they had burned through the night. 2 logs, not 9 cords a month. 2 logs. She had done the arithmetic. She had written it in the private book. Then she had written something else, a number she had not written there before. The number of cords they would need for the rest of the season, then the number they had. The difference. For the first time since October, the difference was positive. She closed the private book. She made coffee. 3 days later, Dale Pruitt came. He came in the afternoon, alone on foot, across the field that separated their properties, wearing his good coat rather than his work coat. He knocked. Nell opened in the door. He took off his hat. He said, "I heard the smoke from the chimney looked different." She said, "Come in." He came in. He stood in the main room and he felt the air, the way everyone felt the air who entered the cabin now, with a moment of adjustment, the body recalibrating to a temperature it had not expected. The cabin was 58 degrees. In March in Minnesota, in a frontier structure, 58 degrees presented itself simply as fact. Dale looked at the chimney coming up through the floor. He looked at the absent stove. He looked at Walt, who was at the table with his drawings, the technical specifications he had been working on since the third lighting, the documentation of everything he had built, and what he had learned from building it wrong the first 2 times. Then Dale Pruitt turned and he looked at Nell. Not Walt, not the drawings. Nell, who was standing near the kitchen doorway with her hands still bearing the faded marks of the clay work folded in front of her. He said, "Ma'am." She waited. He said, "I was wrong." He said it to her. Not to Walt, to her. Nell looked at him for a moment. She said, "Come and feel the floor, Mr. Pruitt." He crossed the room. He knelt down with some difficulty because his knees had been on frontier land for most of a decade, and they showed it. He placed his palm flat on the floor directly above where the stove now sat in its underground chamber. He felt the warmth come up through the wood and into his hand. He stayed there for a moment. Then he stood up and he looked at Walt and he said, "Tell me how it works." Walt told him. He laid the drawings on the table and he explained the system from the beginning. The chamber, the chimney angle, the intake pipe, the thermal medium of clay and sand and stone that Thomas had understood and June had helped calibrate through her weeks of soil and temperature observation. He explained the failures and what the failures had taught him. He explained every component. Dale listened with the attention of a man evaluating information for immediate application. He asked questions that were specific and practical. When Walt finished, Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll be back next week. With my son, I want him to understand this." He came back the following week with his son and two neighbors. Walt spent an afternoon explaining the system, answering questions, walking three men through the physics and the construction and the lessons of 2 months of failure and adjustment. Nell served coffee. She moved through the room quietly refilling cups, listening to the conversation, occasionally placing a clarification into the discussion when Walt's explanation became imprecise in ways that mattered. She did this without drawing attention to the correction. She simply placed the accurate information into the conversation and let it find its own level. June observed all of this from the corner of the room where she was doing her lessons or appearing to do her lessons. Her journal was open in her lap beneath the table. She wrote, "3 men came today to learn from Father." Mother knew the answers to 4 questions before Father did. She answered 2 of them. The other 2 she let Father find on his own. I am beginning to understand that this is a skill, knowing which things to say and which things to let someone else discover. It might be the most important skill in the house. By May, Dale Pruitt's cabin had a buried stove system. By mid-May, 3 other families had begun construction. By early June, 7 cabins in the settlement had buried stove systems, and word had traveled to a neighboring settlement, a day's ride east, and settlers were writing letters requesting specifications. On an evening in June, Nell was sitting at the kitchen table with both books open in front of her when Walt came in and sat across from her. He looked at the 2 books and then at her face. He said, "How are the numbers?" She turned the private book around and pushed it across the table to him. He read it. He took his time. He read the caloric calculations from January, the allocation tables, the projected cost of the rebuild. He read past the page she had shown him in February, past the caloric tables, and he found the page she had not shown him. He found the $8. He found the sequence of decisions that failure would have required. He found the names of their 3 children written at the top of the page that listed the worst-case outcomes. He read it all, and then he set the book down, and he looked at her across the kitchen table. He said, "You knew we only had $8. She said, "Yes." He said, "Before I started digging." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you said try it anyway." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside through the kitchen window, the June light was doing what June light does in Minnesota when winter has finally released its hold, staying for an unreasonable time in the evening gold and generous as if making up for the months of its absence. The fields were green, the frost line was gone. The earth that had been frozen 6 feet down in January was now warm to the surface and beyond. Walt said why Nell looked at him. She followed the question to its actual meaning. He was not asking why she had kept the number from him, and he was asking something deeper. He was asking why, knowing what she knew, she had still said yes. She said, "Because I knew what you were capable of, and I knew that $8 was not the most important number. The most important number was whether the idea was right." He said, "And you thought it was right." She said, "I thought it was worth finding out." He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers and held it there without saying anything else because there was nothing else that needed to be said. June was in the doorway. She had come for something from the kitchen and had stopped when she saw her parents at the table, not wanting to interrupt, finding she could not move away either. She stood in the doorway and watched her father hold her mother's hand over 2 open books, and she understood that she was looking at the interior of something most people never see: the private architecture of a marriage that had held under the weight of a winter that had been designed or had seemed designed to break it. She went back to her room. She opened her journal. She wrote, "I have been keeping this journal since September. I thought I was writing about the cold in the system and the earth at different depths in the temperature of the floor. I think I was actually writing about what it means to hold a family together when holding it together requires everything you have and more than you have, and still requires you to wake up the next morning and continue holding." She wrote, "Mother did that. She did it without being asked and without being thanked and without letting anyone see the weight of it until the weight was gone." By the winter of 1888, the improvements Walt had designed over the summer were installed. a secondary air valve to moderate the system's temperature, adjusted ratios of sand to clay in the thermal medium, refined using June's density observations from the original excavation. The system ran the cabin at a consistent 50 to 55 degrees even on the coldest nights. Wood consumption fell to just over 1 cord a month, a reduction of nearly 90% from the 9 cords of the previous winter. By 1890, there were 43 documented buried stove systems operating across the Minnesota Territory. The regional death rate from cold-related illness dropped by 60%. Elderly settlers who had been preparing to leave the frontier because they could no longer withstand the cold were able to stay. Children who had been chronically ill in previous winters were healthy. Rebecca slept in her own bedroom every night. June's handwriting in her journal improved across the winter of 1888, the letters no longer cramped by cold, stiffened fingers, but open and steady, the handwriting of a person who has enough warmth to think about something other than warmth. The agricultural journals eventually wrote about the system. The history books eventually mentioned it. They described Walt Harmon as its inventor, which was accurate in the way that attributions are accurate when they identify the person whose hands built the thing, while leaving out the person without whom the hands would have stopped. June knew this. She wrote about it in her journal with the measured clarity of someone who has decided that accurate documentation is its own form of justice, even when the record is private. She wrote, "History will say, my father built the system. This is true. It will not say that my mother decided the system was worth building, worth failing again, worth the $8 that were all we had, and that she committed without hesitation and without telling anyone she was doing it." History does not usually have a category for this. I think it should. Decades later, the historian who found June's journal would sit with it for 3 hours and not put it down. He would later write that the journal represented the most detailed first-hand account of frontier environmental observation conducted by a child in the Minnesota Territory. He would describe June Harmon as a young scientist working in conditions that would have defeated most adults whose systematic temperature and soil density records had contributed in ways her father had later acknowledged in his own documentation to the final design of the thermal medium that made the system work. He would also note in a passage near the end of his analysis that the journal's most consistent subject was not the earth or the temperature or the buried stove system. Its most consistent subject was a woman named Nell, moving through a cabin in the dark, checking the fire, carrying 2 books, saying yes to things that required everything she had. On the last page of the private book in Nell's handwriting, there was a single entry dated March of 1888. 1 year after the third lighting, 1 year after the floor came warm, it said, "Wood this month 1 cord, food sufficient, children healthy. Walt is working on improvements for next winter. I am thinking about what comes after surviving, which is a thought I have not been able to afford until now." Below that, in the same careful hand, "It is enough. It is more than enough." Below that, nothing. The rest of the page was blank. The rest of the book was blank. She had stopped writing in it because she no longer needed it, because the private weight she had carried through the winter of 1887 had been set down in the spring of 1888 and had not needed to be picked up again. The book survived. The journal survived. The cabin did not eventually, as cabins do not. But the warmth that had been generated in it spread outward through 43 other cabins, and then beyond them, through communities and through winters, and through the lives of people who never knew the name. Nell Harmon, and never knew about 2 books or $8, or a woman kneeling on a warm floor in late March with her hands pressed flat against the wood and her shoulders finally still. The frontier that had been trying to end them had instead made them permanent, not in the way that monuments are permanent, in the way that warmth is permanent, which is to say it passes from one thing to the next and changes what it touches and cannot be taken back once it has been given.